Hello and welcome to Water Stories, the podcast. I'm Eve Barro, and this podcast is a production of BioBAT Art Space. As we embark on each episode, we invite you to immerse yourself in exciting discussions that illuminate the vitality of water, echoing the themes explored by the artists featured in our Brooklyn exhibition on show until June 2025. Enjoy! Today we are speaking with Maria Montero Sierra. Maria is an art historian and curator who is currently head of program of TBA 21 Academy. In her work, she explores the relationships between marine and human ecosystems from the prism of eating. In 2022, she started leading a fascinating research program called Convivial Tables, which operated as a series of collaborative tasting experiences aimed at highlighting the complex ties between what we eat and its ecological impact, with a particular focus on its effect on bodies of water. Maria, thank you so much for joining us today to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
To accompany this food research project, Convivial Tables, you co-edited with, I think, Barbara Nardacchione, a publication which our listeners can find online. And I was going through it in preparation for this conversation today. And it starts with this really beautiful quote, which I think holds so many different layers that I hope we can discuss today. And it goes like this: "There is no better place to talk about food than around a table while eating. Sitting at a table, enjoying a delicious meal inspires reflections on the crafting of meals, cooking, and the growing and harvesting of the produce shared. We reconnect with memories of comfort food that root us back to local and beloved place. No doubt, the shared table inspires conversations, also about food." I think it's very fascinating how this project seems to exist at the intersection of so many things: the cultural and natural reality of food and its shared aspects in terms of the people you're eating with and the whole ecosystem and marine ecosystem and more than human entities that are part of it. So to start off, I would be really curious to hear more about the genesis of this project, from your own journey and how it fits within your work, to how this project was first formed and what it's really about.
Thanks for reading it. It was very nice to hear it back, this starting point. So I have to say, first of all, that Convivial Tables is a collaborative project, that it was initiated or conceived in 2021, but really initiated in 2022 by Marcus Raymond, who at the time was the director of TBA 21 Academy and is now the co-director of the foundation of TBA 21. My colleague, Barbara Nardacchione, who also co-edited the publication, who runs the public program at Ocean Space, and myself. And we had the idea that we wanted to have a sustained program on food. And because it is a topic that we know the food industry, the food supply is one of the biggest harms of the ocean with the larger impact. But it's something that at the foundation at TBA 21 Academy that we have been for, at the time, already more than 10 years working with the subject of the ocean and the arts involved in looking into different epistemologies, cosmologies, and actual activist travels, that we were not really dealing with the subject of the food. And at that same time, I was already for a year and a half, a little bit longer, working in a project that is called Fish and Fly, which you mentioned in the introduction. So we came together to make a sustainable project that will be focused and that will expand some of the initial activities, a few that we have had at Ocean Space. And we will concentrate on knowing about the ties between ecology and food and how it affects the bodies of water in the context of the Lagoon of Venice, which is complex, rich, and it was a lot to learn from and with the people. So that's how it started. And some of the initial thought was for sure that we will have as a main collaborator Marco Brabetti, who is a chef and also the founder of Toccia, a food and community. And he was already involved in a project that we have at Ocean Space the year before. He was also part of one of the walks that my colleagues Pietro Consolani and Barbara Casavecchia were doing. And he is a magnificent chef, but it's also someone that is for a long time invested in two aspects that they were central. Conviviality, because he is practice and taught it is about eating together and sharing, and very much exploring the ecosystem of the lagoon and the supply system. So he is creative, is exploding, but also his knowledge on the ecology is super rich. So we were working with him. And I think for this first edition, mostly, we have, I think each one maybe we have different understanding, but I will say for me, I think one of the main aspects was to acknowledge the community of Venice that were already discussing and invested in sustainable soil, different ways of harvesting that are with cares, and exploring menus as well that will reflect into both the crafts of the past, but also introducing new ways of cooking or new ingredients that have become wild in the ecosystem, right? That they're like exploding. So how do we deal with all these aspects? And so when I say a rich community, is really, there is so much in Venice. It can go from scientists that are working at the Oceanographic National Marine Institute, ISMAR, to marine biologists that have projects with seafood linked to the Ca' Foscari University, activists, other artists, other architects. Like, there was so many people, and it was like, what do we bring also to the table? And I think we were very interested on the idea of affection and affectivity. So that was a big part to honoring those who were already there and contribute with something else, and with our focus particularly on the ocean, but really understanding this interaction. So considering the more than human as part of that relationship. Another aspect, I think that it was quite central, and that thing to Barbara and myself that we were creating the first edition, it was that we didn't want that it will be a restrictive and ban approach. It was not only about don't do that, don't do that, don't do the other. We wanted to acknowledge that food, and I think the text that you read, it goes back to that, food is comfort. I think even for those who have experience of a starvation and difficult experience, and we know many, I think there is always a moment, or I want to believe maybe, but there's always a moment of seeing food as a comfort and connecting with a communal space, with a caring and sharing moment. And there is also a lot of identity in those experiences, right? We tie food with identity. So it was like how we can travel this, the idea that we want to experience the comfort and affectivity, that we have to travel somehow these identities, to explode them, to questioning them, and that we do it from a propositive. So we wanted to be propositive, and that's why we wanted to build the menus. That's why we wanted to invite different voices to discuss it, people that knew about Venice, people that didn't know much about Venice, but they were coming from other knowledge. So we wanted to be propositive, both in where we will discuss it, where we will share afterwards, and our approach to it.
That was really interesting, and I love how you mentioned all these concepts of conviviality, affectivity, caring and sharing and connecting while you're experimenting with the food and with sharing this space. I'm curious about how it practically works. What were the events like when you first started? Also, because you mentioned how so many people were part of the conversation and everyone has their own little thing to bring to the conversation, but you're still so grounded in the lagoon of Venice. So what happened when all these people got together?
So we were working on exactly. What do we want to bring? How do we want to activate these concepts, these ideas, and then the reflection? So one aspect was conviviality. It was the idea of sharing a table. What does it do to share a table and a menu and ingredients to the experience of eating? My take on it, and I was like bringing a lot of that because of other projects that I have and my personal interest, it was performativity. What is the choreography that we are bringing it? And I think they were laughing at me and how and I will explain who we will invite it, I will bring all the time this question. So what is your choreography? We came together with the idea that we will have 3 moments that they will be dedicated to this community and for us to know each other and reflect on the ideas. So there will be 3 convivial tables, 3 dinners that we will spend together with 3 subjects that we will choose later on, and 1 public event where we will share. And so we have these 3 dinners at Ocean Space, and we were in the middle of one of the works that we have at the exhibition at the time, which actually was talking about toxicity, which will become one of our subjects. And it was the work of Cigatera by Diana Policarpo. And then the public event was what we was called the Sagra. Sagra is the festives in the neighborhoods of Venice that happen over the summer. Almost every other weekend in one of the neighbors there is a Sagra. And this is the moment of the neighbors to gather together and share meals. And so we wanted to have this Ocean Space Sagra, but that the food will be reflecting some of the ideas and some of the contributors that we have been working through this journey that we initiate together early in the spring. So coming back to what happened when we were doing these 3 meals, it was like, yes, we want to share a table. So we are going to have a long table and we are going to be around 15 people. We want that this is the moment of bringing some of these local foodies that I will call some of these rich, incredible minds and actions that are working and know so much about it and they're interested. And then let's share a lot. And of course, many of them, they are colleagues and they know each other, but let's be together in this. And the other was what I was mentioning about this choreography. So what will be the rhythm? Because for me, it was important that we instigate a reflection. And it was very difficult, right? Like, how do we move from the knowledge that we have about the harms of the food industry? How do we move, and I don't mean move away, but how we build the steps between what it is happening in the ecological space, what are the transformations that are occurring in the Venice Lagoon, and how it reflects on the ways that we regularly eat. And how do we reflect on that and how we change or make propositions of do otherwise or do it more consciously? And so that journey, how do we trigger it? How do we build on it? It's maybe a curatorial exercise. And so we invited conductors. And so the conductor, like if we were in a foodie opera or if we were like just introducing new mannerism to eat. All of us, we have eaten mannerism that we have been taught since we were child. But what mannerisms are the ones that are not going to be about not so in your mouth, minimize the act of eating, but actually reinforce the art of eating, visibilizing, and yet discussing about all these complications that are building a tie, and at the same time that they are showing our implication in the harms that we are producing. So there is this interconnectivity that is like friction in each other. And so it was super important, the role that the conductor plays. And we have amazing people like Jane Damosto, who is a Venezia, not original, but she is for decades there. And she is trained as a biologist, but she is also the founder of the activist group We Are Here Venice. We have Camila Maravio, who is a researcher, curator, writer. She comes from Chile, but she was in Venice as the curator of the Chilean pavilion, working with peatlands. So we were engaging as well. And we have Ana Perdivon, who is an anthropologist and interested in history of religions, who is from Venice. And they will, together with the chefs, and be Marco Bravetti, one of them, but also Silvia Rosas and Marco Safran, who are working in Venice to design menus that will reflect the subjects that we propose to them, salinity, toxicity, and invasive species, and take it into a new direction. So that's what it happened. Then we will eat together. We will have the chef introduce each of the menus, each of the dishes, which have many different roots, all connected obviously to the histories of Venice, but also the connections with other places. Then we will have the choreographies that they have put together. And then we will have what happen in any table, particularly if you are 15 people, is that you are discussing with your person sitting next to you. And sometimes it's not about the topic. It is about who you are, or what are you doing, or just regular other stuff. So that is part of eating together and sharing, right?
Yeah, the conversations are triggered by what's happening. Yeah, that's so interesting. Actually, I think you might have brought a little recipe for us that you could share with us. And maybe you could also tell us more about these new choreographies and new mannerism that can be triggered by the food itself and the experience of the food that you had.
Yeah, I am very grateful for the work and the instigations that the conductors brought. So we, for instance, the last table happened in September, early September, and it was after the month that traditionally the fishing is banned in Venice, and that was perfect to discuss about the so-called invasive species. So Anna Perdivon and Silvia Rosas and Marco Safran, they decided to focus on plants and the idea of wildness. And so Anna was reading us an extract of Breeding Sweet Grass by Robin Wald Kimmerer, and about indigeneity, naturalized, invasive, what does it mean? And what it was very interesting is how it also reflects on the menu, both on the ingredients that they choose, as well as on the techniques. They were doing a salad with wakame, which we might think is an Asian algae, but actually, I learned, is one of the most invasive plants, so-called invasive plants, that they are fast in developing in the lagoon. And at the same time, they were bringing it tomatoes being the ultimate vegetable or fruit, depending how you call it, that represent Italy, again, with these ideas of identity, but tomato coming from Americas. And so there will be anecdotes of some people explaining that it actually took, and I don't know if I remember correctly, but around 200 years for tomato to be understood in Italy as something to eat and not just a decorative plant. So how long does it take, and when do we accept that something new is introduced in our diet? But the way that then Silvia and Marco, they introduced it, it was like by changing the technique and use stigmatization, which came originally and has been widely used in Mexico. So it was this coming back, right? You bring the tomato, but then you treat it back into a technique that it is not widely used in Italy, and it's not the way that they are usually present the tomatoes, but it goes back into, in a way, its source. So there was this idea of completely complexize the trading system, which is at the core of the travel of eating, right? The harvesting, the distribution channels, which talk about many historical extractivist practice often, not always, not the way that we want to do it, but this is a reflection, and the eating, cooking and eating being the final one. So they were merging this one, and that was very interesting. You have something like Marco Burabetti on the first meal introducing the idea of salinity, with a whole performatic approach in which we will have a rice, but we needed to, each of us, extract the salty water that he has put. So it become almost like a lagoon with an island, but we needed carefully to extract it in order for the actual broth to come in and to finish the cooking on the classic meal as well for the region, and talk about the waterlands. And so there were all these gestures, not only on the techniques and the food, but also in the performative to be aware. In this case, they were looking, Jane and Marco, on the tides and how the lower and higher tides affects the level of salinities in the lagoon, which is a complicated human, natural, managed ecosystem. But I'm happy to read you. I was doubting which of the menus to bring, but since I have spoken about salinity and so-called invasive species, maybe I can read you one of the recipe that we have in the publication that touch upon toxicity.
That would be amazing, yes.
I think it would be nice to bring the reflection of the conductor of Camila Maravio. So I am just quoting her before reading the menu in her beautiful poem. And just in the middle, it says, consider toxicity a quality that invites counteraction. Map the flows within and outside your body. See yourself enveloped in change of commerce and extractivism that can be altered. If we choose less, learning from our mistake, and eat widely, orondo, knowing we are always eating with others, commensality could become a remedy to toxicity in and around us. And what we had from then that we can practice, that was the idea, practice other forms of eating and reflected on the tides. So here is the recipe of a toxic salad by Marco Brabetti, and is for 4 people. And the ingredients, I don't know if accessible to everyone, but the ingredients are bitter almond milk, parsley oil, edel flowers, young fig leaves, hyssop, sal mars wormwood, marine inula, sea fennel flowers and leaves of the paracris, Malabar spinach, targets marigold, orange lemon balm, Vietnamese cilantro. And the recipe goes, for the bitter almond milk, soak 200 grams almonds and 50 grams bitter almonds overnight in 1.5 liters of water. The next day, drain and blend with another 1.5 liters of water, then strain. And for the parsley oil, blend equally weight of seed oil and parsley leaves, washed and dried. Leave to infuse for 24 hours in an airtight container. Strain through a fine sieve. And the important, the planting. Ensemble the salad of leaves and edible flowers and dress with the bitter almond milk and parsley oil.
I'm salivating already.
I have to say this salad was a challenge. I think it was one of the most challenging moments, because what Camila and Marco Brabetti were discussing and inviting us to reflect, it was about the level of toxicity. Camila will provocatively tell us that we actually like to be intoxicated, but only to certain levels, right? Like alcohol intoxicate us, sugar intoxicate us. So what the whole night was reflecting was on the level of toxicity. And this salad, as they introduced to us, and I don't now recall which of the flowers, but one of them is toxic if you eat more than, I don't know. And it was really chili, like super spicy. So everyone was like, do I want to eat it? And so we were very hesitant and we were looking to each other. Is this one? Do I really want to eat it? Is it going to harm me? And the second level that Camila introduced so beautiful, it was like she would let us, her choreography, she let us message to each of us to read. Then we had a table that was covered with a paper tablecloth that we could write over. And then halfway the menu, the dinner, we will change seats. And these questions and the journey that she walked us through were reflecting on how we feel our organs. If we were getting hotter, if we really feel our liver, do I know where it is, this part of my digestive system, what is doing to me, what I am doing to it. And so if that is happening on my body, would it happen in the ecosystem body? And how we are affected. But again, this idea that the toxicity is good to a certain level, or that we play with it. And at the same time that we are so, I was going to say clueless, that we are, so blind to, while we eat, what does it do to our body? And so also, I guess, when we are harvesting, where we are looking into foraging, and that was another topic. Shall we foraging? No, there is an encounter, but that's not the best way to keep the wildness alive. It has a role. Are we intervening too much by thinking that this is the craft to maintain? But there is also not reflection probably on how we are perturbing or affecting that body. So there was a lot of things happening.
I think it's so interesting how you mentioned that as you were eating the food, then you had to think about what it's doing to your body and think about, okay, what does it do to another system that's like outside of my body, but maybe that would be experiencing something similar in terms of toxicity. It's almost like you're forming connections or like bonds that maybe you wouldn't have thought about. And there's something that you mentioned, which was, I think, a shift of attention. So shifting your attention to things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think about in your daily practice of eating, and using these dinners to practice new ways of eating where you shift your attention. And I'm wondering if you could say a few more words on this, on what happens when you shift your attention to other bodies of water, which maybe operate like your body of water, because we are made of a lot of water. So what happens when you shift your attention and you build these new connections with other ecosystems and environments and species?
Curatorially speaking, to me, this was the most interesting part, to really try to create mechanisms, introduce mechanisms, they are not new, that will facilitate that switch of attention. And I think that was very important. If I am honest, I think that it is not replying to your question of what had happened. I think there is a need to continue, right? They need to keep building it. Because if you go to the publication and you see the menus that were created, they were really innovative and really simple. Like at the same time, the rice with the salt, it was just bringing the simple ingredients and double check, where do they come from? How I interacting in that way, I become aware that the salt is part of the changing on the waves, or on how too much salt it is creating an excess of a certain ecosystem. And you mentioned system, and it's very difficult to interrupt that system, right? Because the interconnectivity is quite large. I was just like thinking about the salinity and how it affects the ecosystem, but at the same time we are using it for so, and it's part of the trading system. So every piece that you are touching, and that happens specifically with food, through food, is very easy to build those interconnectivities, grow and grow exponentially. And I think back into the project, what it was relevant is not only to discuss about this interconnectivity as a system, but actually on these affections and feelings. So introducing changes, but it was introducing changes in a playful ways that will it change? Behavioral change, it is something very difficult to intervene. but it will create hopefully a memory of what it was thought at the time, what it was shared at the time. And I think that was very important, as well as to translate those reflections into the publication.
It's very interesting because I think maybe for a lot of people, when we think of our impact on our environments and our communities, and I think that's especially true for bodies of water in the ocean, I think often there's a lot of grief associated to it. And it's so interesting how you mentioned trying to highlight the affective bond that we can have with it and being playful, creating memories, and this almost, yeah, I guess it always goes back to conviviality, taking a playful approach to it, which maybe would differ from other ways of engaging with it that would be based on other types of emotions. And I think at the very beginning of the interview, you mentioned how food is comfort. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, how maybe food allows us to be more playful and to be thinking about the joy and the connection that we have with others, and how maybe that would differ or offer a different ways to engage with our environment.
It definitely is, for me personally, an easier entry point, because it's, on the one hand, super embedded in our everyday routine, because traditionally I come from a place that include meals as part of socialized practice. So that was very important, this idea of the sharing and being active. But I also think that for me, it has a lot to do with what I explore in Fish and Fly, which is the idea that the bite is a moment of engaging, it's a moment of knowing and connecting. But if we go back into what are the practices that sustain that care approach that happen also through the bite, and that is very questioned, I think, mostly on our Western tradition, less so if you go to indigenous practice. Some of them, at least, will not reject the idea of the catching of a fish or the harvesting as a process of tide and connection and care. But so how this practice of caring through all the processes that involve eating demonstrate care. And I was very particularly interested on the way that performance and storytelling were informing those practices. And I don't refer to performance in the sense of art performance or theater performance, but really in our personal everyday choreographies, not everyday, but the things that we have learned, which show this caring. So there's this text that I always back to, so I thought, in a way, I transfer, I'm paraphrasing her description of some Canadian First Nation communities that she is very close to, and the way that they experience fish and also fishing. And she said, for me, almost like you are dancing with the fish. You are on the boat and you really need to see how the fish move in order to catch it. And I go back to this story because it's part of dance and choreography, but it's also this idea that you need to look to your partners, that you need to read and attune to this ecosystem. And that practice can only happen, I think, if you have enough time to dedicate it, if you are focusing there. That is also slow in the process. It's not something that I can do or I practice. I live in a city, I grow as a city person. That's also why my first connection to the ocean is through the bite, because that's how the saltiness come into my body. How do I smell it? There are many people that don't like eating fish and seafood precisely because it is too oceanic, it's too salty. And I am not saying that they are not experienced processes of caring, but I was interested in that interconnectivity. And I think this is where can bring this interconnectivity, that it's passed through generation, and it is showing certain gesture, certain timing, certain attuning. Okay, this is the season to do something, because we know the salmon comes at that moment and it will be already grow. Those are the things that we have dismissed in general by our globalized taste. And I think that is for me this moment of engaging with each other. It is part of building a new agreement, as I am interested on seeing. And the story tells. So one of our guests who joined the full journey of Convivial Tables, and it was part of reflection of my colleague Barbara Nardacchione, of inviting some artists, and there is this self-painter Luigi De Vari, who is fantastic. I really like it since another colleague, Alice, introduced me to his practice. The way that he works and how he explains you how he works, and he's an archive in itself, an archive all the flora and the fauna of Venice and how it has transformed over the decades, is that he fish in the lagoon, fish one thing, then bring it home. She paint in watercolors beautifully, and we have it in the publication accompanying the menus. And then after that, he cook it. And then after that, he eat it with his family. So this is another way, I think, to find this reflection, interconnectivity, come into touching, one with each other. I was playing with the idea of almost kissing a fish bite to bite.
I think it's a beautiful way to finish this conversation. You mentioned this really inspiring idea of the bite as a daily encounter, a daily and caring encounter with the ocean. And I think that's a very inspiring statement. And I'm sure our listeners will reflect and salivate when thinking about this. So thank you so much for being with us today. It was such a interesting and fascinating and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our other episodes online on our platforms, as well as in our listening room in our exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Bye!